When I left the orphanage, they said I inherited a sealed bunker. What I built there changed everything. If you've ever felt like your life was decided for you, like you were just a number in a file, stick around. This story is for you. Hit that subscribe button because we're going to talk about what it means to find a home in the last place you'd ever expect. The day I turned 18 was the day I ceased to be a problem for the state of Oregon. There was no cake, no party, just a cardboard box containing 2 pairs of jeans, a handful of t-shirts, my birth certificate, and a worn copy of a book I'd read 100 times. The book was the only thing I truly considered mine. Mrs. Gable, the director of the County Youth Authority, a place that had been my home since I was 7, handed me the box with a thin, practiced smile. "Well, Leo," she said, her voice as crisp as the starched collar of her blouse. "You're a man now. The world is yours." It didn't feel like mine. It felt like a locked door, and I was on the wrong side of it. She handed me a final envelope. It was thick, beige, and felt heavier than it should. Inside was my final stipend, $250, and a letter from a law firm I'd never heard of. The air in her office smelled of industrial cleaner and regret. I'd been breathing it for 11 years. I was institutionalized, from the way I walked with my shoulders hunched to the way I never made eye contact for too long. I was a product of the system, and the system was now officially done with me. I walked out the heavy front doors, the ones that always locked behind you with a deafening click. This time, the silence that followed was even louder. The October air was sharp and cold, biting at my cheeks. It felt different out here, freer, but also terrifyingly empty. The street was lined with unfamiliar cars, unfamiliar houses, unfamiliar people walking dogs and carrying groceries. For 11 years, my world had been 100 yards of chain-link fence and 3 floors of cinder-block rooms. Now it was endless. I stood on the sidewalk, clutching my box, feeling smaller than I ever had inside. The stipend was enough for a week at a cheap motel, maybe 2 if I ate nothing but instant noodles. After that, I had no idea. The world wasn't mine. I was just trespassing in it. I opened the beige envelope again and pulled out the lawyer's letter. The letterhead was simple. Davies and Associates, attorneys at law. The message was brief. It requested my presence at their office to discuss the final settlement of the estate of one Thomas Miller, my grandfather, a man I barely remembered, a ghost from a life before this one. I had a vague memory of a kind face with deep-set eyes and the smell of sawdust and pipe tobacco. He'd disappeared from my life around the same time my parents did, in a car crash on a slick winter road. I was told he'd moved away, unable to cope. I'd spent my childhood believing he'd abandoned me. Now, a decade later, he was a name on a legal document. The letter said he had passed away 6 months ago and had left his entire estate to me, his sole heir. I laughed, a short, bitter sound that turned into a cough in the cold air. Estate. What a joke. The man I remembered lived in a tiny cabin in the woods. His estate was probably a box of fishing lures and a stack of old magazines. Still, it was a destination. It was more than I had 5 minutes ago. The law office was on the 2nd floor of a tired-looking brick building downtown. The stairs creaked under my worn-out sneakers. Mr. Davies was an older man, with a halo of white hair and a face etched with the kind of weary patience that comes from dealing with other people's problems for a living. His office was cluttered with stacks of paper and heavy-looking legal books. It smelled of old paper and coffee. He shook my hand, his grip surprisingly firm. "Leo," he said, his voice gentle, "thank you for coming. Please, sit." I sat in the worn leather chair opposite his desk. It sighed under my weight. He slid a thick file across the desk. My grandfather's name was on the tab. "I was your grandfather's lawyer for over 30 years, he began, folding his hands on the desk. He was a unique man, very private, very determined. He paused, looking at me over the rim of his glasses. He spoke of you often, worried about you. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. Worried? The man who had vanished? I didn't say anything. I just listened. Mr. Davies explained that my grandfather hadn't been a wealthy man in the traditional sense. There was no stock portfolio, no savings account overflowing with cash. "He left you one thing, Leo," the lawyer said, leaning forward. "His property. About 50 acres of land up in the Cascade foothills." 50 acres. The number sounded impossibly large. I pictured forests and mountains. It seemed unreal. "But there's a complication," he continued, his tone shifting. "The land itself isn't the main feature of the inheritance, and there's an offer on the table to buy it, a very generous one." He explained that a company, Apex Development, had been trying to buy up all the land in that valley for years. They were planning a luxury resort. My grandfather's 50 acres was the last holdout. They were offering $300,000 for it. The number hit me like a physical blow. $300,000. It was more money than I could even comprehend. It was a new life. It was an escape from the future I saw for myself. A future of minimum wage jobs and cheap apartments. "Why didn't he sell?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "He could have lived comfortably." Mr. Davies sighed. "Thomas was attached to the land. He said it held his life's work. He made me promise that when you turned 18, I would present you with two things, the deed to the property and their offer. The choice of what to do with it, he said, had to be yours." He then slid a small, heavy metal box across the desk, along with a set of old-fashioned keys. "This is from him." He was very specific about this part. The box was cold to the touch, made of dark, scarred steel. "He left you the property, which consists of a small, dilapidated cabin, and what he referred to in his will as the shelter. It's a sealed underground structure he built himself, a bunker." A bunker. The word hung in the air between us. My grandfather, the quiet man who smelled of sawdust, had built a bunker on his land. The romantic image of a wise old man in the woods shattered, replaced by something else. A paranoid recluse? A doomsday prepper? The generous offer from the development company suddenly made more sense. Maybe they thought he was crazy. Maybe they just wanted the land and didn't care about the strange old man who lived on it. "The keys are for the cabin and the bunker," Mr. Davies said. "The offer from Apex Development is on the table. They're willing to pay you that sum for the land and everything on it, sight unseen. All you have to do is sign, and you can walk out of here and start a new life." It was the easy way out. It was the smart way out. Take the money, forget the ghost of a grandfather who had abandoned me, and run as far away from my past as I could. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to sign the papers, but something held me back. That metal box, the keys, the mystery of a man I never knew. What was his life's work? Why a bunker? "I need to see it," I said, the words surprising me as much as they seemed to surprise Mr. Davies. "I need to go there first." He nodded slowly, a faint smile touching his lips. "I thought you might say that," he said. "Your grandfather would have been glad." The bus ride to the foothills took 4 hours. I watched the city bleed into suburbs, then into sprawling farmland, and finally into the dense, dark green of the Oregon wilderness. With every mile, the concrete and noise of my past life receded, replaced by the quiet hum of the engine and the blur of endless trees. I held the cold metal box on my lap, my fingers tracing the scratches on its surface. It was locked with a small, simple key that was on the same ring as the larger, more complex keys for the property. I resisted the urge to open it. My grandfather had left me the place, the keys, and this box. It felt right to open it there, on his land. I felt like a character in a story, but I didn't know what kind of story it was yet. A tragedy? A mystery? A horror? I spent the journey lost in thought, replaying the scant memories I had of Thomas Miller. I remembered him teaching me how to skip stones on a creek, his large, calloused hand guiding mine. I remembered the scent of pancakes and coffee in his small kitchen, and I remembered the day the social worker came to take me away. He wasn't there. They told me he'd left a note, saying he couldn't handle raising a child alone. I had hated him for that. For a long time, that hatred was a shield, the only thing that protected me from the pain of being utterly alone. Now, that shield was cracking. The bus finally wheezed to a stop in a small town called Hemlock Creek. It wasn't much more than a single main street with a gas station, a general store, and a diner with a flickering neon sign. The air here was different. It smelled of pine needles and damp earth. It smelled clean. I got my directions from the woman at the general store. She looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and pity when I told her where I was headed. "Old Man Miller's place?" she said, her eyebrows rising. "No one's been up there in years, not since he passed. You his family?" I nodded. His grandson. The word felt foreign on my tongue. "Well, good luck to you, son," she said, her expression softening. "It's a long walk." It was more than a walk. It was a pilgrimage. The paved road gave way to a gravel one, and then the gravel road dissolved into a dirt track that wound its way up into the hills. The sun was beginning to set, casting long golden rays through the canopy of fir and cedar trees. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of my footsteps and the occasional call of a bird. After nearly an hour of hiking, I saw it. A rusted mailbox, half swallowed by ferns, with the name Miller barely visible. A narrow, overgrown path led from the road into the woods. I pushed my way through the tangled branches, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The path opened into a clearing, and there it was. The cabin was exactly as I'd pictured it, small, made of dark, weathered logs, with a sagging porch and empty, staring windows. It looked like it was slowly being reclaimed by the forest. It was a place of deep neglect, a monument to a forgotten life. And then I saw the other structure. To the side of the cabin, half buried in the hillside, was a large, flat rectangle of concrete. In the center of it was a heavy, windowless steel door, painted a faded military green. It was secured with a massive, industrial-looking wheel lock, like something you'd see on a submarine hatch or a bank vault. The bunker. It was real. It was larger and more imposing than I had imagined. It didn't look like a storm shelter. It looked like a tomb. A cold dread washed over me. What had my grandfather been so afraid of? I walked to the cabin first. The key slid into the lock with a rusty shriek. The door swung open into a single, dusty room. There was a simple cot, a wood-burning stove, a small table with one chair, and shelves filled with books. It was Spartan, the home of a man who needed little. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the air was stale with the smell of abandonment. I ran my fingers along a bookshelf. The titles were about history, geology, engineering. There were hand-drawn maps of the local area pinned to the wall, covered in strange notations. It wasn't the library of a madman. It was the workspace of a scholar. I left the cabin and walked over to the bunker. The steel felt cold and final under my hand. I found the right key, a strange, multi-pronged thing that looked more like a medieval torture device than a key. It took all my strength to turn the wheel lock, which groaned in protest. With a final deep clang, the mechanism released. I pulled on the heavy door, and it swung inward with a low hydraulic hiss, opening into perfect darkness. A wave of cool, dry air washed over me, carrying a scent I couldn't place, a mix of earth, metal, and something else. Something clean, like ozone. I fumbled for a light switch just inside the door, not expecting it to work. But when I flipped it, a series of long, humming fluorescent lights flickered to life, illuminating a set of concrete steps leading down. I took a deep breath and descended into the earth. The stairs opened into a vast, single room. It was at least 50 feet long and 30 feet wide, with a high, arched ceiling. It wasn't a shelter filled with cots and canned goods. It was a workshop. One wall was lined with workbenches covered in tools, lathes, drills, soldering irons, all meticulously organized. Another wall was floor-to-ceiling shelves, but instead of food, they were filled with neatly labeled archival boxes and binders. In the center of the room was a large drafting table with a single stool. This wasn't a place of fear. It was a place of work, a place of purpose. On the central workbench, right in the middle, sat a single object, another metal box, identical to the one Mr. Davies had given me. My hands were shaking as I placed the box from my lap next to it. They were a pair. I used the small key from the ring to unlock the box Mr. Davies had given me. Inside, there was no treasure, no money. Just a thick stack of envelopes, bound with twine. On top was a single sheet of paper with my name, Leo, written in a strong, steady hand. I sat down on the stool, the only chair in this vast, silent space, and began to read. The letter was dated a week before my grandfather died. "My dearest Leo," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have made the choice to come here. I am glad. I am also so very sorry. I know you must have grown up believing I abandoned you. I know you must hate me for it. I want you to know that not a day has gone by that I haven't thought of you, that I haven't regretted the choice I had to make. But I need you to understand why I made it." He went on to explain that after the car accident that killed my parents, he had become my legal guardian. But he had been in the middle of something dangerous. He had been uncovering a crime, a massive, decades-old fraud that had ruined dozens of families in this valley. The people responsible were powerful, and when they found out he was digging into their past, they had threatened him. But it wasn't his own safety he was worried about. They had threatened me. They told him that if he didn't stop, something would happen to the orphan boy. A tragic accident, an unfortunate mishap. He knew they meant it. So he made an impossible choice. He staged his own disappearance. He created the story of a grieving old man who couldn't cope and ran away. He worked with Mr. Davies to have me placed into the state system, believing that there I would be just another face in the crowd, anonymous and safe. He had given me up to save my life. I had to stop reading. The letter trembled in my hands. Tears streamed down my face, dripping onto the dusty concrete floor. I wasn't crying for the boy who had lost his grandfather. I was crying for the man who had lost his grandson. The 11 years of bitterness and hatred I had carried inside me dissolved, replaced by a profound, aching grief. He hadn't abandoned me. He had protected me. Every day of my life in that institution had been an act of his love. He had spent the rest of his life here, alone, turning this land into a fortress, not to protect himself, but to protect his work. The bunker wasn't for surviving an apocalypse. It was for preserving a history. The letter continued. Everything you need to understand is here, in this room. This place is not a shelter, Leo. It is an archive. It is a vault. For 40 years I have been gathering evidence. The other box on this table contains the key to it all. But I must warn you, if you open it, if you choose to see this through, you will be putting yourself in danger. The same people who threatened you as a child are still out there. They own Apex Development now. The offer they made for this land isn't about building a resort. It's about burying this bunker and everything in it forever. They want to buy your silence. You can take their money, Leo. $300,000 is a fortune. You could disappear, start a new life, and be safe. No one would blame you. It is more than you have ever had. Or you can stay. You can finish what I started. You can bring the truth to light. The choice is yours, and yours alone. Whatever you decide, know that I have always loved you. Your grandfather, Thomas. I sat there for what felt like hours, the silence of the bunker pressing in on me. The weight of his words, his sacrifice, settled over me. He had given me an out, a clean, simple, and wealthy escape. All I had to do was walk away, sign a piece of paper, and pretend this place, this history, didn't exist. I could be free. But it wouldn't be freedom, would it? It would be another kind of cage. A gilded one, maybe, but a cage nonetheless, built with guilt and the knowledge that I had sold out the only person who had ever truly fought for me. I looked around the room. The neatly organized boxes, the carefully maintained tools, the hand-drawn maps. This was a man's life, a life spent in pursuit of justice, a life lived in lonely exile for the sake of his grandson. How could I let it all be for nothing? How could I let them pave over his legacy? I stood up and walked over to the second metal box. My hand hovered over it. This was the point of no return. This was the moment I chose my life. I thought about the emptiness of the past 11 years, the feeling of being nobody, of having no history and no future. And I thought about the man who built this place, who had given me both. I opened the box. Inside it was packed with journals, old photographs, and stacks of legal documents tied with string. The top journal was bound in worn leather. I opened it to the first page. The entry was dated 45 years ago. "It starts today," my grandfather had written. "They think they can steal the valley, that they can erase a generation of families from the map with a few forged signatures and a crooked judge. But I will be the valley's memory. I will not let them forget." I spent the next 2 days in that bunker, emerging only to sleep on the dusty cot in the cabin. I lived on the few protein bars I had in my backpack and water from an old hand pump outside. I read my grandfather's journals, one by one. He had documented everything. The story he pieced together was one of staggering greed and corruption. In the 1970s, a small group of wealthy investors, the founders of what would become Apex Development, had systematically swindled dozens of local families, many of them poor farmers and loggers, out of their land. They used predatory loans, forged documents, and legal intimidation to acquire hundreds of acres for pennies on the dollar. They built their fortune on the ruins of a community. My grandfather had been a young land surveyor at the time. He saw what was happening and tried to blow the whistle, but he was ignored, threatened, and eventually fired. So he began his own quiet investigation. For 4 decades, he had tracked down the displaced families, collected their stories, found copies of the original deeds, and gathered evidence of the fraud. The archival boxes were filled with it all. Notarized affidavits from people who were now scattered across the country, expert analyses of forged signatures, and a detailed paper trail that led directly to the company that was now offering me a fortune for my silence. This bunker wasn't just an archive, it was a weapon, and my grandfather had just handed it to me. The fear was real, a cold, creeping thing that settled in my gut. These people had threatened a child. What would they do to a young man who now held the power to destroy them? But alongside the fear was something else, a burning sense of purpose. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just a ward of the state, a piece of driftwood on the current. I was Thomas Miller's grandson. I had a history. I had a fight that belonged to me. That night, I made my decision. I wasn't going to sell. I was going to fight. The next morning, I walked the long road back to Hemlock Creek and used the payphone outside the general store to call Mr. Davies. "I'm not signing the offer," I told him, my voice firmer than I'd ever heard it. "In fact, I think we need to talk. I have something you need to see." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Leo," he said finally, his voice heavy with a mix of concern and, I thought, pride. "I'll be there tomorrow morning." Mr. Davies arrived in a dusty sedan, looking out of place in his suit and tie against the backdrop of the wilderness. I led him to the bunker. He stopped at the entrance, his eyes wide as he took in the scale of it. "My God, Thomas," he whispered to himself, "what were you building?" I walked him through everything. I showed him the journals, the boxes of evidence, the meticulous records. He spent hours poring over the documents, his lawyer's mind piecing together the narrative of the crime. By the end of the day, he took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, looking older and more tired than ever. "This is explosive," he said. "This is enough to launch a massive class-action lawsuit. It could bankrupt them. Leo, do you understand what you're sitting on here?" "I think so," I said. "It's justice." "It's also a declaration of war," he countered, his voice grave. "Apex will not take this lying down. They will come after you. They will try to discredit you, to intimidate you, to break you. Are you ready for that?" I thought of my grandfather, alone in this bunker for all those years, holding on to this truth. He had been ready. "Yes," I said, "I am." The first shot from Apex came a week later. A formal letter arrived from their legal team, increasing their offer to $500,000 and giving me a 48-hour deadline to accept, after which, they said, the offer would be rescinded, and they would pursue legal means to acquire the property through eminent domain for a vital community development project. It was a bluff, and we knew it. Mr. Davies sent a polite refusal. The next shot was less formal. 2 men in dark suits showed up at the property in a black SUV. They didn't get out of the car. They just parked at the end of the path for a whole day, watching. It was a clear message. We see you. We know where you are. I spent that day inside the bunker, the heavy steel door locked, my heart pounding with every rustle of leaves. But they left at sunset, and they didn't come back. They were trying to scare me into running. It almost worked. But then I looked at my grandfather's handwriting in his journals, and the fear turned into resolve. I wasn't just fighting for myself or for his memory. I was fighting for the families in those files, the people whose lives had been shattered. I started to clean the place up. I scrubbed the cabin from top to bottom, repaired the leaky roof, and got the old wood stove working again. It became my home. I spent my days in the bunker, organizing my grandfather's research, digitizing the documents, and creating a comprehensive database of the evidence with a laptop Mr. Davies had brought me. The bunker, once a place of secrets and isolation, became my office, my mission control. The work was slow and methodical. It grounded me. It gave me a routine, a purpose. I started to feel like I belonged there, on that patch of land, in that strange concrete room. Mr. Davies began the painstaking work of tracking down the descendants of the families my grandfather had documented. He found them scattered all over the country, old men and women who remembered the stories of their parents losing their farms, and their children and grandchildren who had grown up hearing tales of the stolen valley. At first, they were skeptical. It was a wound that was generations old. But when we showed them the evidence my grandfather had collected, the copies of their family's original deeds, the affidavits their grandparents had signed, their skepticism turned to a slow-burning anger, and then to hope. We held the first meeting over a conference call, a dozen voices from a dozen different states, all connected by this shared history of injustice. I sat at the drafting table in the bunker, listening to them share their stories. For the first time, I spoke. I told them about my grandfather, about his sacrifice, and about the choice he had left me. I told them I wasn't selling the land. I was using it to fight for them. By the end of the call, we had formed a coalition, the Hemlock Creek Justice Project. The news of our lawsuit hit the local papers. Apex Development's stock took a hit. They responded with a vicious public relations campaign, painting my grandfather as a delusional conspiracy theorist and me as a young, impressionable opportunist trying to extort them. They painted their resort project as a source of jobs and prosperity for the region, and us as obstacles to progress. Some people in the town believed them. They saw me as a troublemaker, the weird kid living in the crazy old man's bunker. But others started to remember. Older residents came forward with their own stories, memories of the pressure and the strange land deals from the 70s. The tide of local opinion began to shift, slowly but surely. This is the point in the story where everything gets really hard. The legal threats, the public pressure, the isolation. It was a heavy burden. And if you've ever felt the weight of the world on your shoulders, if you've ever had to stand up for something you believe in, even when you were terrified, I want you to know that your struggle is valid. This community right here, in these comments, is a place for people who have faced those fights. So take a second and let me know in the comments, what's a battle you fought that made you who you are today? I read every single one, and your stories matter. Now let's get back to it. The fight dragged on for months, then over a year. It was a war of attrition. Apex had teams of expensive lawyers who filed motion after motion, trying to bury us in paperwork and drain our limited resources. The families in our coalition pooled what they could, and Mr. Davies worked pro bono, but it was a struggle. There were days I felt like giving up. The loneliness was crushing. I would sit in the cabin at night, listening to the wind in the trees, and the weight of it all would feel unbearable. During those times, I would go down into the bunker. I'd read my grandfather's journals. His words became a conversation across time. He wrote about his own moments of doubt, his own fears. But he always came back to the same core belief, that the truth, no matter how long it's buried, will always find its way to the light. He never gave up. So how could I? Something unexpected started to happen. The bunker, which I had once seen as a strange and imposing inheritance, began to transform. As more people got involved in the case, it became our headquarters. We installed a better internet connection, set up tables and chairs. Descendants of the original families would make pilgrimages to the property to see the evidence for themselves. They would stand in the bunker, looking at their own family names on the old documents, their eyes filled with tears. It was no longer just my grandfather's archive. It became a living museum, a community center, a monument to their stolen history. It was a place where their past was honored and their future was being fought for. This is what I was building. It wasn't a house or a company. It was a community. It was a movement. I wasn't just the keeper of the archive anymore. I was the caretaker of a legacy, and I wasn't alone. I found a part-time job at the general store in town to make ends meet. The owner, a woman named Sarah, whose own grandfather had lost his land in the swindle, gave me the job without a second thought. Working there, I started to meet people, to become a part of the town. I was no longer the kid in the bunker. I was Leo, the boy who had walked out of an institution with nothing but a cardboard box, was finally putting down roots. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. One of the archival boxes contained a set of old geological surveys my grandfather had conducted. They were covered in his notes. He had discovered that the valley contained significant deposits of rare earth minerals, minerals that were becoming increasingly valuable in the tech industry. Apex Development wasn't planning a resort. The resort was a cover story. They knew about the minerals all along. Their plan was to acquire the last piece of land, my piece, and then sell the entire valley to a mining corporation for a massive profit. They weren't just covering up a past crime. They were planning a future one, an open-pit mine that would destroy the entire valley, the ecosystem, and the watershed for the entire region. This changed everything. Our lawsuit was no longer just about rectifying a historical injustice. It was about protecting the future of the entire community. We had environmental groups join our cause. The story went from a local dispute to a statewide issue. Apex was exposed, their lies unraveled, their stock plummeted, and their investors panicked. Facing a massive, multi-front legal battle and a public relations nightmare, they finally folded. They came to the negotiating table. It wasn't a total victory. We couldn't turn back the clock. We couldn't give everyone their original land back. But we achieved a settlement that was more than any of us had dreamed of. A massive financial restitution was paid out to the 53 families in our coalition, a sum that acknowledged the generational wealth that had been stolen from them. Apex Development was forced to divest from all its holdings in the valley. And in a move that my grandfather would have loved, the bulk of the land they had acquired was donated to a newly formed community land trust, to be preserved as a public park and wilderness area forever. As for my 50 acres, I kept it. It was my home. The bunker is still there, but it's not sealed anymore. The heavy steel door is always open. We turned it into the Hemlock Creek Historical Center and Community Archive. It's a place where the true story of this valley is told. School kids come on field trips. The descendants of the families we fought for have their reunions here. It's a place of truth, of memory, and of resilience. I often stand on the hill overlooking the valley, the same view my grandfather must have looked at for all those lonely years. I think about the word inheritance. When I first heard it in Mr. Davies' office, I thought it meant money. I was wrong. My grandfather didn't leave me a piece of land. He left me a purpose. He didn't leave me a bunker. He left me a foundation. What I built here wasn't made of wood or concrete. I helped build a community. I helped build justice. And in the process, I built a life. I am no longer a ward of the state. I am a guardian of a legacy. I am no longer an orphan with no history. I am the grandson of Thomas Miller, the man who remembered. The world doesn't feel like a locked door anymore. It feels like an open field, full of possibility. The future is no longer a void. It's a responsibility I am grateful to carry. My story started at an ending, the end of my time in the system. But it was really a beginning. It was the start of a journey to discover that home isn't a place you're given. It's a place you build. Sometimes you have to build it in the most unexpected of places. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, if you believe that our past, no matter how painful, can be the foundation for a powerful future, then I hope you'll subscribe and become a part of this community. What we inherit isn't just property or money. It's the stories and the struggles of those who came before us. What we choose to do with that inheritance defines who we are. So, I'll ask you one last time. What is the most important thing you've ever inherited, and what are you building with it? Let us all know in the comments below. Your story matters. Let's keep building something meaningful together.